The Man Behind the Myth. Part 1. The Magazine. The magazine arrived on a Thursday. Chuck Norris was in the back room of his Torrance dojo, wrapping tape around a cracked, heavy bag that had been cracked since February and kept getting pushed to tomorrow's list, when Paulie dropped it on the workbench beside him without a word. The current issue of Black Belt, still in its plastic mailer, the kind of delivery that came with a subscription Chuck had never ordered and kept receiving anyway because someone, somewhere, had decided that the world champion middleweight should receive his own industry's trade publication as a courtesy. He didn't pick it up immediately. He finished the tape job, pressed the wrap flat with his thumb, tested the bag's give with 2 short strikes. Then he picked up the magazine. His own face looked back at him from the cover. Not a photograph taken that day or that year. A photograph from a tournament 2 years earlier, the 1971 All-American, in the moment directly after the final match, when he was standing in the center of the floor and someone had gotten a camera angle that caught him before the expression settled, before the public face came back on. He was looking at something outside the frame. His expression was open in a way that he recognized as his own, but that felt strange to see reproduced and scaled up and laminated and mailed to himself. The headline above the photograph read, "The Living Legend. Who is the real Chuck Norris?" He stood in the back room for a moment with the magazine in his hands. The question on the cover looked back at him. He was 32 years old, and he had been competing for 8 years and winning consistently for 4, and the word legend had started appearing in the way people talked about him, with a casualness that suggested they had stopped thinking of it as a description and started thinking of it as a name. Not Chuck Norris the man, Chuck Norris the legend, Chuck Norris the fighter who never loses, Chuck Norris the unbeatable. He set the magazine on the workbench and went back out to teach his 4 o'clock class. But the question followed him through the afternoon. Who is the real Chuck Norris? He taught the 4 o'clock and the 5:30, and during both he moved through the room with his usual precision, correcting, demonstrating, noticing what needed to be noticed. His students watched him with the specific attention of people in the presence of something they consider exceptional, and he watched himself being watched and felt, underneath the comfortable competence of the familiar routine, something he did not immediately have a name for. It was only later, standing alone in the dojo after the last student had gone, that he identified it. He did not know how to answer the question. Part 2. The Man in the Photograph. There was a reporter. His name was David Kessler, and he wrote for a magazine that covered martial arts and fitness, and occasionally, in a tone that tried to bridge the distance between journalism and mythology, the lives of people who had become symbols of something larger than their own biography. He had called the dojo 3 times in 2 weeks, each time leaving a message with Paulie that said the same thing. He wanted to write a profile, a real one. Not the tournament stats and the undefeated record and the championship timeline. Those had been written already, by everyone. He wanted to write about the man. Chuck had not returned the calls. On a Tuesday morning in March, Kessler appeared at the dojo in person. He was 40 years old, bespectacled, with the particular physical quality of someone who thinks for a living and has made peace with what that looks like. He came in during the 10 o'clock intermediate class, sat in the row of chairs along the back wall that Chuck kept for observers, and watched for the full 90 minutes without producing a notebook or a camera or any of the paraphernalia of his trade. He watched the way someone watches who is genuinely trying to understand what they are looking at rather than confirm what they already think. After the class ended and the students had filed out, Chuck walked to the back wall and sat in the chair next to Kessler's. "You could have called ahead," Chuck said. "I did," Kessler said. 3 times. Fair enough." Chuck looked at the empty dojo floor. "What do you want to know?" Kessler's was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been covering martial arts for 11 years. I've written about a lot of champions, and the thing about champions as a category is that they're usually very clear about who they are. It's part of what makes them champions. The clarity comes first, the certainty about what matters, about what you're for. The wins come after. He paused. You're different. Different how? You seem like you're still figuring it out, which is interesting, given that you've been undefeated for 4 years. He looked at Chuck carefully. I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean it as the most interesting thing I've noticed about you. Chuck said nothing. Kessler said, the magazine piece I want to write isn't about your record. Your record speaks for itself. I want to write about what it costs to become what you've become, what you had to put down in order to pick up what you're carrying. He paused. I don't think anyone has asked you that question. The dojo was quiet around them. The smell of the morning's work was still in the air, the cedar and the effort and the residue of concentrated attention. Chuck looked at the floor where 2 hours ago 23 people had come because his name meant something to them, because what he had built here was a place they trusted with their improvement. I'll give you 1 hour, he said, not for the profile. I'm not ready for the profile, but I'll talk to you for an hour off the record. Kessler nodded. That's enough, he said. Part 3. Off the record. They sat in the office. Paulie brought coffee. Kessler left his notebook in his jacket pocket. Tell me something true about yourself, Kessler said. Something that doesn't appear in the record. Chuck thought about it. I was afraid of my father, he said finally. Not physically. He was physically harmless, mostly. He was an alcoholic who went on binges and left and came back, and the damage he did was the damage of absence rather than presence. But I was afraid of becoming him. I think I've spent 15 years building something, the discipline, the training, the wins, as a way of proving to myself that I was going to be a different kind of person. He paused, and somewhere along the way the building became the thing, not what I was building toward, just the act of building. Kessler didn't write anything down. He listened. There was a period, around 1966, 1967, when I was winning, but I hadn't won everything yet. And I knew I was good, but I didn't know yet if I was the best. And in that period, I was more alive than I've been before or since. I was hungry in a way that sharpened everything. Chuck turned the coffee cup in his hands. After I won the championship in '68, something changed. Not immediately. There was joy, obviously, real joy. But underneath it, something quieted that I hadn't expected to quiet. The hunger, Kessler said. Something related to it. More like the question. There was a question I was trying to answer through the training and the competing, and then I answered it, and the answer turned out to be less satisfying than the question had been. He was quiet for a moment. I kept competing because I'm good at it, and because not competing when you're good at something feels like waste. But I don't know if I compete for the same reason I started. Why did you start? Chuck thought about an Air Force base in South Korea, about a shy kid from Oklahoma who had never been good at anything and who had walked into a room and discovered that his body could learn a language his mind had never known. Because I needed to know what I was made of, he said. Because I'd never had a test I could measure myself against. Because every environment I'd been in before had been about surviving, and this was the first thing that was about becoming. Kessler nodded slowly. And now you're known. You have a public self that has weight in the world, and the question is whether the public self and the actual self still resemble each other. Chuck looked at him. That's the question. Do they? A long pause. Outside the office window, he could hear a car pulling into the parking lot. The next class's first arrival, 20 minutes early. The sound of someone who had set an alarm to come here, who had organized their morning around the idea of Chuck Norris the teacher, Chuck Norris the standard. Less than I'd like, Chuck said. Part 4. The night class. There was a student named Robert Ellis. He was 17 years old, and he had been training at the dojo for 8 months, and he was not the most talented student in the program. There were 3 or 4 who were more naturally gifted, who picked up sequences faster, whose bodies translated instruction into movement with less intermediary effort. But Robert Ellis came to every class. He came to class when he was sick. He came to class when he'd had a bad day at school. He came in the rain and the heat, and on evenings when everything about his posture when he walked through the door said that the last thing he had the energy for was this, and then he trained anyway with a consistency that Chuck found more instructive to observe than any of the natural talents. He stayed after one evening in April. Chuck was closing up, turning off the equipment room light, double-checking the window locks that always needed checking, when he heard the sound of someone still on the floor. He came back out and found Robert in the center of the room, running a sequence they had covered in class that day, alone in the quiet. The same 8 movements repeated with the methodical patience of someone who has decided they are going to understand something and is prepared to spend whatever time that takes. Chuck leaned against the doorframe and watched. The movements were not polished. They were not the movements of someone who has arrived at understanding. They were the movements of someone in the middle of the process, imprecise at the edges, uncertain in the transitions, with the particular quality of effortful concentration that has not yet graduated to ease. But there was something in them, a quality of genuine engagement, of actual presence, of a person putting themselves into the act rather than performing it. That made them more interesting to watch than the polished versions of students who had arrived at technique without arriving at what it meant. After a while, Robert noticed Chuck watching and stopped. "Sorry," he said, "I know you're closing." "Don't stop," Chuck said. "Show me what you were working on." Robert ran the sequence again, self-consciously at first. Then, as Chuck watched without expression, settling back into the focused effort he'd been in before. When he finished, he looked at Chuck with the particular uncertainty of someone who wants feedback and is not sure if they should want it. "What do you think you're doing when you do that sequence?" Chuck asked. Robert considered. "Deflecting an incoming force and redirecting it. What does that mean? In your body? What are you actually doing?" A longer pause. "I'm trying to get out of the way without actually moving out of the way." Chuck nodded. "That's closer." He walked to the center of the floor. "Do it again, but this time I want you to stop thinking about what you're supposed to do. I want you to think about what the sequence is for, not the technique, the purpose." Robert ran it again. This time something shifted. Small, barely visible, but present, a quality of intention that had not been there in the earlier repetitions. The movements were no different, technically, but they were different in the way that matters. Chuck stood very still and understood something. He had been watching himself compete for 4 years in the way Robert had been running that sequence before Chuck asked the question. With the technique correct, the outcomes positive, the external markers all in order, but without, he reached for the word, without the reason that had been there at the beginning, without the purpose underneath the technique. "That," Chuck said quietly, pointing to what Robert had just done, "that's what you're going for." Part E5, the conversation with himself. He called his mother that evening, which was not unusual. He called his mother on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sometimes on Sunday evenings when the week had been particularly full. She was 60 years old and lived 20 minutes away in the same Torrance neighborhood she had moved to when Chuck was 12, and she had the quality of presence on the phone that she had always had in person, an absolute undivided attention that made the person she was listening to feel that what they were saying was the most important thing happening anywhere in the world at that moment. He told her about the magazine cover, about Kessler, about the question he couldn't answer. "Who is the real Chuck Norris?" she said. She said it the way you repeat a question back when you want to actually hear it rather than just respond to it. That's what the headline said. "Do you know?" "I know parts of it," he said. "I know the part that trains at 5 in the morning. I know the part that's good at this specific thing. I know the part that came from Ryan, Oklahoma, and was embarrassed at school and moved 16 times and watched Dad walk out." He paused. I know those parts. What I'm not sure of is whether they add up to a person or just a history." His mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When you were 8 years old, you found a dog on the street. Do you remember that?" He didn't immediately. Then he did. A thin brown dog, some kind of terrier mix, malnourished, with a cut on its front leg that had been left untended. He had brought it home and cleaned the cut himself, carefully, with the focused attention of a child doing something important. "You stayed up all night with that dog," his mother said. "You slept on the floor next to it so it wouldn't be alone. Your father was on one of his, he was gone, and you were 8 years old and you made sure something that was hurt wasn't alone." She paused. "That's who you are. Everything else, the titles, the undefeated record, the magazine covers, those are things you've done. But that's who you are." He sat with that for a long time after the call ended. The legend that the magazine had put on its cover was made of tournaments and championships and years of training. It was made of things done publicly, things measured and recorded and assessed by observers. The person his mother had described was made of something else, a quality of attention to what was in front of him, a refusal to let something hurt go unaddressed, an orientation toward the small and the nearby that had nothing to do with whether anyone was watching. He had been worrying that becoming a legend had killed the human. What he understood now, sitting in his office with the magazine on the desk in front of him, was that the question itself was wrong. The legend did not kill the human. The human was still there, still exactly the same, still the child who slept on the floor so a hurt animal wouldn't be alone. The question was whether he was letting it breathe. Oh, Part 6. What Kessler wrote. He called Kessler the following week and said he would do the profile. "Off the record's over," he said. "You can use it." Kessler came in on a Thursday afternoon with his notebook and his camera and a tape recorder that he set on the desk between them and turned on without ceremony. He asked questions for 2 hours. Some of them Chuck answered easily. Some of them he sat with for a long time before speaking. Some of them he started to answer and then stopped and corrected himself and started again, which Kessler received without impatience, waiting with the professional stillness of someone who understands that the second attempt at an answer is usually the honest one. Near the end of the session, Kessler asked, "What do you think you owe the people who look up to you?" Chuck had thought about this. "Not the image," he said, "not the invincibility, not the undefeated record as a statement about what's possible. I think what I owe them is the truth that it's hard, that becoming good at something hard enough that other people notice, requires a specific quality of engagement that has nothing to do with talent and everything to do with showing up for something that is genuinely difficult and not walking away from it when it gets worse." He paused. "I think people look at a champion and see the distance between where they are and where the champion is, and they feel the distance as a verdict on themselves. And I think that's wrong. The distance is just a timeline. Every champion was a beginner at the same things everyone is a beginner at. The difference is not ability. The difference is sustained engagement with difficulty." He thought about Robert Ellis on the dojo floor after hours, running a sequence for the 100th time with the patience of someone who has decided they are going to understand it. "What I owe people," he said, "is not to pretend the hard parts were easy. Because if I pretend they were easy, then the people who are struggling with the hard parts think there's something wrong with them. And there isn't. The hard parts are just hard. That's what they are." Kessler wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. One more. The magazine cover asked who the real Chuck Norris is. "Do you have an answer now that you didn't have when you saw it?" Chuck thought about a dog with a cut on its leg, about an 8-year-old on a floor, about the quality of attention that his mother had described, not as something exceptional, but as the most ordinary and essential thing about him, the thing that was there before the training and the championships and the legend and would be there after. "I think the real version of a person," he said, "is the version that shows up when nobody's watching. Not the performance, Not the image, not the thing the magazine photograph catches, the version that stays up with the hurt thing because leaving it alone is not an option. He met Kessler's eyes. I'm still working on whether the public version of me has room for that person. I think it does. I think it has to, or the whole thing is just architecture. He paused. Then, I'm 32 years old. I have a long time left to figure it out. EPI Logoth. The cover that didn't run. Kessler's profile appeared in black belt 3 months later. It did not have the tournament photograph on the cover. Kessler had fought for a different image, a photograph taken in the dojo on an ordinary Wednesday, Chuck mid-conversation with a student, his expression showing the particular quality of focused attention that his mother had named and that he had learned to recognize in himself, present, undivided, interested not in the performance of instruction, but in the actual transaction of understanding passing between two people. The headline read, Chuck Norris, What the Undefeated Record Doesn't Tell You. He read it sitting in the office on the morning it arrived, alone, with coffee that had gone cold because he had forgotten to drink it. When he finished, he set it on the desk and sat with it for a while. The article was accurate. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever written about him, not because Kessler was a particularly gifted journalist, though he was competent and fair, but because it was the first piece that had asked the right question and waited for the honest answer. He thought about all the things the undefeated record did not tell you. It did not tell you about the 10 losses before 1968, the years of being dominated and outclassed, and going home to train harder because going home to stop was not in the vocabulary. It did not tell you about the specific quality of loneliness that exists inside a streak of success, the way being expected to win removes the possibility of genuine surprise, the way the crowd's certainty that you will prevail creates a distance between you and the actual experience of competing that narrows the space available for the only thing that has ever really mattered to you, which is the pure fact of trying your absolute best at something difficult. It did not tell you about the 8-year-old on the floor. He picked up the magazine and went out to open the dojo. The first students of the morning were already in the parking lot. 2 cars, a bicycle leaned against the wall, a woman who had been coming 3 mornings a week since October and who was beginning to find, he could see in the way she moved, the shift from executing technique to inhabiting it. He unlocked the door and stood in the entrance for a moment before going in. The morning light was coming in at an angle across the floor, the same angle it came in every morning, laying long, bright rectangles on the wood that would move and shorten as the day progressed. He had stood in this door hundreds of times. Each time the light was slightly different. Each time the room was the same room. He went in. He was Chuck Norris, the title holder, the undefeated, the name on the cover of magazines he hadn't asked to be on. He was also the man who got up before 5 to train before anyone arrived. He was also the teacher who noticed when a student ran a sequence after hours in an empty room because they cared enough to stay. He was also the boy from Ryan, Oklahoma, who had been afraid and shy and had discovered at 19 years old in South Korea that the body is capable of becoming something the mind hasn't imagined yet. All of those things were true simultaneously. The legend did not cancel the human carried the legend. That was the order of operations, and it had always been the order of operations, and the only thing he had to do, the only discipline that mattered beyond every other discipline, was to remember it. He started the warm-up. The students came in behind him, one by one, the way they always did, quietly, carefully, taking their places on the floor, with the respect of people entering a space that requires something of them. He heard them behind him and felt them as a presence, a weight, a responsibility that was not a burden but the opposite of a burden, the kind of weight that tells you you are standing on solid ground. He was the real Chuck Norris. He had always been the real Chuck Norris. It had just taken a magazine cover and an hour off the record and a boy running a sequence alone after class to remind him.